On the surface, she looked like an ordinary suburban wife, working to support children with mental health issues. But beneath that appearance lay a shocking story full of secrets. Fred Andros, a man with a shady past, was involved in all sorts of illicit activities. Things started to spiral when one of Fred's colleagues was shot dead right after a choir rehearsal. The gunshots echoed through the night, leaving the remaining members in shock. The subsequent investigation uncovered a series of explosive secrets, bribery, illicit affairs, and underground dealings. This was no random attack. The victim was clearly targeted. The entire town couldn't believe what was happening, and the name Dawn Silvernail quickly became the center of all gossip. She was not as ordinary as people had thought. The whole case played out like a dramatic opera in the heart of America, where the darkest secrets were finally brought to light. Pleasant Valley, New York, October 28, 1999. The choir rehearsal at the United Methodist Church had just ended, and 48-year-old Susan Fassett left as usual. She crossed the street, got into a car, but just seconds later, a series of gunshots tore through the quiet night. At first, the other choir members didn't pay much attention to the sound. But then, someone noticed Susan slumped over the steering wheel, blood spreading all over her body. They rushed to help, frantically calling for emergency services. But amid the panic, a few had caught a glimpse of the shooters disappearing into the darkness. This was no random attack. Susan Fassett had been targeted. And as the police began their investigation, they quickly realized that this case was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind Susan's death was a web of corruption, dangerously intertwined relationships, and dark sexual secrets no one had expected in such a quiet little town. Born in 1949, Dawn Mudge grew up along the Hudson River in Pleasant Valley, near the Catskill Mountains of New York. She was a true country girl, standing nearly 6 feet tall by the time she reached her teenage years. Her life seemed relatively uneventful. 2 years at a community college, marriage at 21, followed by a few years at home raising her son. However, Dawn was not just an ordinary housewife. She built her own career, working for a non-profit organization. Additionally, she was a passionate singer who frequently performed on the radio, delivering country western hits that had once topped the charts. On CB radio, she was known as Delta Dawn. In 1977, at the age of 28, Delta Dawn began chatting over the radio with a mysterious man who called himself Neptune. What seemed like a casual encounter turned out to be the beginning of an entirely new and unexpected chapter in her life. Fred Andros was only 5 feet 6 inches tall, nothing like a god, but the nickname Neptune still fit him perfectly. As the head of the water department, Fred held considerable power and did not hesitate to use it for personal gain. Rumors of bribery and corruption surrounding him were not uncommon. Although he was married, Fred was notorious for being a womanizer. He liked many different women. His charm did not come from his appearance, but from his power and his smooth way of talking. At first, the relationship between Fred and Dawn seemed harmless. They simply talked over CB radio. Fred even brought his wife to listen to Dawn sing. They got to know each other and became friends. But then, the thin line between friendship and an affair quickly disappeared. Dawn did not love Fred. To her, he was just a means to get what she wanted. Whenever she needed something, Fred was always ready to help, and that was what gave him a certain level of control over her. However, not every gift that Fred asked for was physical. Sometimes it was just seemingly simple favors. By the way, can you take this outside for me, or can you drop this off at Joe Smith's house? The envelopes Dawn delivered seemed harmless, but in reality, they contained cash money obtained from the bribery and extortion schemes that Fred ran. When her first marriage ended in divorce, Dawn continued meeting Fred and carrying out his illegal errands for a decade. Even after she remarried in 1992 to Ed Silvernail, a kind man, Dawn seemed unable to let go of the thrill of infidelity. But by this time, Fred's life was about to get much more interesting, far beyond secret meetings or envelopes stuffed with cash. Things started to get serious in 1997, when a body was discovered floating in the Hudson River. The dead man was an inspector, and immediately there were rumors that this was not a suicide. The interesting thing was that it was Fred himself who helped spread those rumors. He hinted that this death might have been a planned execution, suggesting that he had some connection to it. Whether that was true or not remained a question, but these rumors caught the attention of the feds. However, what the FBI was truly interested in was not the bribery network or the illegal activities within Fred's water department. Those were just the surface. What they wanted was a bigger fish, a powerful figure whom Fred had ties to. And to get to this person, the FBI needed Fred to cooperate. So, they began to put pressure on him. By the spring of 1999, the feds had gathered enough evidence to force Fred to comply. He admitted to some close associates, "I need to tell you guys that I might get arrested." But in reality, this was not a big shock to anyone who knew Fred. Seeing that the situation was beyond saving, Fred quickly secured a deal that allowed him to avoid prison, though the price was his career. In May 1999, Fred resigned, and just a day later, he officially pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy. But the case didn't end there. Fred Andros's downfall was about to be overshadowed by an even more shocking scandal. In Poughkeepsie, a case involving another town official, Susan Fassett, was about to explode. Her death was not just a personal tragedy, it revealed the truth behind the seemingly peaceful facade of the town. The first clues in the investigation of Susan's death quickly hit dead ends. The townspeople seemed determined to remain silent, hiding something. But then the police unexpectedly found another suspect along with a shocking secret and a truth that could change everything. Pleasant Valley, New York, October 28, 1999. Susan Fassett was shot dead in the parking lot just after leaving a choir rehearsal. She had just sat in her car and fastened her seatbelt when a cold-blooded killer opened fire and fled. Within minutes, police and emergency medical technicians, EMTs, arrived at the scene. Susan was still breathing, and the EMTs did everything they could to keep her alive. Meanwhile, investigators quickly followed a crucial lead. Some choir members had seen the suspect fleeing. They spotted a car speeding up the hill and even managed to record part of the license plate. After checking security cameras, the police found an alarming result. The car belonged to Jeff Fassett, Susan's husband. Suspicion immediately fell on Jeff. He owned a gun, and more importantly, he was a police officer. Law enforcement quickly surrounded Jeff's house with extreme caution. When he realized the police were outside, Jeff remained calm, speaking on the phone and hinting that he was armed. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Susan Fassett was fighting for her life. But then the SWAT team took action. They stormed the house and arrested Jeff Fassett while he was still armed. Under heavy security and armed surveillance, the police escorted Jeff out of his home and took him straight to the nearest police barracks. Jeff Fassett firmly denied any involvement in his wife's death. However, he revealed that a month earlier, he had discovered Susan was having an affair, and her lover was none other than Fred Andros, the former water supervisor of Poughkeepsie, a man infamous for corruption and secret affairs. The question now was, who killed Susan? Was it Fred Andros? Or was this just a diversion by Jeff to mislead the investigation? Based on Jeff's demeanor in the interrogation room, investigators seemed to believe his story. So they immediately sought out Fred Andros. It was nearly 3 a.m. BY then. When the police knocked on his door, Fred appeared genuinely distraught over Susan's death. He admitted that he and Susan had been involved for nearly 4 years, but insisted the affair had ended over a month ago, which matched Jeff's statement. When asked directly if he was involved in the murder, Fred denied it and even provided a solid alibi. At the time Susan was killed, he was having dinner at home with several friends, including a Poughkeepsie police officer. After 6 hours of polygraph testing, the results confirmed that Fred was telling the truth. So what about the car seen fleeing the scene? Upon further investigation, police realized it might have been a mistake due to misinterpreted information at the scene. This meant that both prime suspects, Jeff Fassett and Fred Andros, had motives to kill Susan, but neither seemed to have pulled the trigger. After the medical examiner completed Susan's autopsy, the investigation suddenly took a new turn. Susan had been shot 6 times with a .45 caliber handgun. But more importantly, forensic tests revealed that she had engaged in sexual activity within 24 hours before her death. The question now was, who had she been with? Jeff, the husband she might have reconciled with? Or Fred Andros, the former lover? Clearly, the person who had been intimate with Susan right before she was murdered was not her husband. When questioned by police, Jeff Fassett stated that the last time they had been intimate was about 4 to 5 days prior. When detectives requested a DNA sample for testing, Jeff agreed without hesitation. But Fred Andros was different. When police asked for a DNA sample from Fred, he flatly refused, a suspicious move. Knowing that Fred would not cooperate willingly, the detectives decided to employ a more subtle tactic. They invited Fred to lunch, pretending to discuss the case further. Unsuspecting, Fred agreed. During the meal, the detectives discreetly collected a DNA sample from the straw Fred had used. The test results quickly confirmed the truth. The DNA found on Susan's body matched Fred's. This meant that Fred had lied. But why? If the two were still involved, why would Fred kill Susan? Or was her death completely unrelated to their affair? With mounting evidence, Fred Andros was arrested. But the true motive behind the murder remained a mystery. Did Susan hold a dark secret that threatened Fred, something that could jeopardize the plea deal he had signed with the federal government? Or worse, was Susan more deeply involved in Fred's shady dealings than anyone had suspected? On December 21, investigators brought Fred into the interrogation room. As expected, federal agents immediately pressed him about corruption, specifically Susan's role in transporting money for Fred. They believed this had led to her death. At first, Fred tried to dodge the questions, stalling for time, but after hours of relentless pressure, his resistance began to crack. The police intensified their push. Perhaps the rest of his life would be spent behind bars. They warned that his previous plea deal could be revoked if he refused to cooperate. This was a devastating blow, making Fred realize he was running out of options. But then, investigators offered him a way out. "Tell us who killed Susan." And at that moment, Fred spoke. He did what everyone had been waiting for. He named the killer. On December 21, 1999, nearly 2 months after Susan Fassett's murder, a grueling FBI interrogation cornered Fred Andros, the disgraced lover of Susan and former Poughkeepsie City official. Under pressure, Fred gave investigators a name he claimed was a crucial lead: Dawn Silvernail. Investigators immediately looked up Dawn's DMV records. When they saw her photo, one of them remarked, "She doesn't look like a murderer at all." But Fred had his own story. He claimed that Susan and Dawn were lovers, secretly involved in a lesbian relationship. This statement forced the police to dig deeper into their records. And then they uncovered 2 crucial details: the murder weapon, a .45 caliber handgun, and the getaway vehicle, a car that matched the description provided by a witness, registered under the name of Dawn's husband. The investigation team immediately set out, driving an hour to Dawn's house for questioning. When they arrived, Dawn was extremely cooperative. She even voluntarily handed over her gun to the police. Dawn admitted she knew Fred Andros. The two had been close friends and frequently communicated over CB radio during its heyday. But when the police mentioned Susan Fassett, her reaction was entirely different. Dawn insisted she had never met Susan. When investigators revealed that Fred had named her as the killer, Dawn's face showed pure shock. He said, "What?" Dawn Silvernail couldn't believe that her longtime friend would throw her under the bus like this. Considering Fred Andros's shady reputation, the fact that Dawn Silvernail was a married woman, and most importantly, that she had voluntarily turned over her gun, police leaned toward believing her. But when investigators sent the gun for forensic examination, they immediately noticed something suspicious. Someone had deliberately tampered with the barrel. This meant one of two things. Dawn was indeed the killer, or someone had borrowed and altered her gun to frame her. On December 28, when police summoned Dawn Silvernail for another interrogation and informed her that her gun's barrel had been tampered with, her demeanor immediately changed. She became more anxious, more concerned, and above all, more honest. Dawn admitted to having an affair with Fred Andros, but she insisted it was not love. It was a form of repayment. The shocking truth began to unfold. Fred not only had a relationship with Dawn, but also paid her to sleep with his friends. Not all of Fred's friends were men. In the summer of 1999, Fred made a new offer. "I want you to sleep with a woman I'm seeing, and I'll record it. I'll pay you $350 in cash." That woman was Susan Fassett. However, by the end of the summer, Susan wanted out. She wanted to go back to her husband, to leave Fred Andros and his twisted games behind. But Fred wouldn't allow it. Dawn admitted that she pulled the trigger, but not alone. Fred was the true mastermind. He didn't just blackmail her, he started making threats against her family. He showed Dawn a photo of her son leaving his shift at the factory, placed it in front of her, and coldly said, "You have to do this." And so Dawn did. One shot, then 5 more. Susan Fassett collapsed in the church parking lot, and Dawn Silvernail officially became a murderer. Dawn's confession was more than enough for police to arrest her for murder. Her only hope was that she could tell her story in court and receive a lighter sentence. On December 29, police knocked on Fred's door, but no one answered. They didn't stop. A team of investigators entered the house, searching every corner. All signs indicated that Fred had been there. They went up to the attic, but Fred Andros had no intention of being arrested. He picked up a gun, pointed it at himself. The gunshot echoed. When police stormed in, they found only Fred's body on the floor, blood spreading across the room. Fred Andros had taken his own life. On January 29, 2001, at the Dutchess County Court in Poughkeepsie, the trial for the mastermind behind Susan Fassett's murder officially began. But the accused was not only Dawn Silvernail, the one who pulled the trigger, but also the man who orchestrated it from the shadows, Fred Andros. A year earlier, Fred had attempted suicide to escape justice, but fate was not on his side. He survived, his face left so disfigured by his injuries that he was barely recognizable. Today, he entered the courtroom to face justice. Dawn Silvernail was not present at the start of the trial. She was isolated, waiting for her turn to testify against Fred, whom she insisted was the real mastermind. She had agreed to a deal with prosecutors. Her life sentence was reduced to 18 years in exchange for her testimony. As the trial began, prosecutors laid out a sharp argument. Fred Andros had planned Susan Fassett's murder when she dared to leave him. He had manipulated everything. But Fred pleaded not guilty, shifting all the blame onto Dawn, painting a narrative that she was the mastermind, that she acted out of hatred. However, when Dawn took the witness stand, the horrifying truth was finally revealed. Her voice trembled, but every word cut through Fred's facade. "I'm sorry for killing that woman," she choked out, eyes filled with regret. Then she told everything. Fred had forced her to kill Susan. He had threatened her, manipulated her, and used her son as leverage to corner her into committing the crime. Before pulling the trigger, she had no intention of killing Susan. But when Susan stepped into the parking lot, casually opening her car door and fastening her seatbelt, Dawn had no choice. She raised the gun, finger tightening on the trigger. The gun fired once, then twice, then again, until it was empty. It all happened in seconds, but it changed her life forever. In a panic, she sped away, stopping at a payphone. She picked up the receiver, her hands still trembling from the horror she had just committed. "It's done," she said. Fred wasn't just behind the murder. He made sure the evidence disappeared. He drilled the gun barrel to prevent police from tracing the bullets, staged everything to pin the blame on Dawn. But his plan fell apart in that courtroom. With everything laid bare before the jury, Fred Andros had no escape. And finally he bowed his head and pleaded guilty. Fred Andros was tried for masterminding the murder of Susan Fassett in October 1999, and in the end, he was forced to bow his head and plead guilty. He admitted to orchestrating Susan's killing and even confessed to having been with her less than 24 hours before she was shot to death. With irrefutable evidence against him, the jury reached its final verdict. Fred Andros was guilty. But his fate was not in the hands of the court. It was in the hands of Dawn Silvernail, the woman who pulled the trigger, the woman he had manipulated into becoming a murderer. It was Dawn's testimony that put Fred behind bars, bringing an end to the days when he could so easily hide his crimes. Fred was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but fate did not grant him much time. Less than 2 years after his conviction, Fred Andros collapsed from a heart attack in prison, marking the end of a man who had once held power but was ultimately undone by his own sins. Following Fred's death, his daughter accepted the jury's verdict, making no attempts to defend or restore her father's name. As for Dawn Silvernail, the woman who had carried out the killing, she too paid a heavy price. Though her sentence was reduced due to a deal with the prosecution, no punishment could weigh heavier than the memories she was forced to carry for the rest of her life. Every night, every time she closed her eyes, she was forced to relive the moment she pulled the trigger, the sight of Susan collapsing, the echo of gunshots ringing in her mind, never able to escape the crime she had committed.